He told me to stick a piece of gum in my shoe when I go for a job interview. That's just what I do. I don't know if it works. Right? Okay, so that's another bar here. And we're going to put them all together in a little bit. All right. So, what another bar of the word prison here. And is something we can call the negativity bias. Anybody heard this phrase before? It's pretty popular in the sort of positive psychology work. They talk a lot about the negativity bias, and if you're familiar with like Rick Hanson's work or Dan Siegel, that stuff, like they're way into this stuff because they're like neurobiological basis. They're sort of looking, okay, what is the central nervous system designed to do? Well, it really is designed to keep us alive, right? Organize the organism and help us relate to an external environment so that we can adapt and we can nourish the organism and procreate and evolve and grow into this beautiful display. So, the negativity bias. So let's take a sort of evolutionary perspective, and two phrases that I like to use that I've borrowed from people much wiser than myself. Actually, I think one of them I made up, so that was just a conceited statement. I'm wise. One of them is from the wiser person than I. It's better to miss lunch than to be lunch. Right? And then the other one is probably before that. It's like, we are descendants of anxious and avoidant apes. And so here, let me illustrate this. Okay, so let's bring us back. We are like on the savannah. It's a very different climate. We just descended from the trees. And, well, we're a little bit further along than that. Maybe there's some language happening here. So we've got these two dudes, Og and Rock, and they're out wandering around. They're hungry. Their tummy's growling. And Og is like, oh, look at that. There's a bush. Oh, I think it's got blueberries in that bush. And Rock is like, well, I don't know what that is. I can't see that bar. I think it might be a bear. I was like, oh, I think it's a bush. Oh, you go. I'll meet you back at the cave tonight. And Og goes off to the bush, and Rock goes out, and he like finds his like taro root or something. And they come back at the cave, and he's like, oh, Og is just like, oh, this is awesome, man. Total blueberry bush. It was great. You should have been there. And Rock is like, all right, he's a little hungrier. It's not psyched that he didn't have the sugar. Next day, they go out and see a new area. Og is like, oh, there's an apple tree or something. And he's like, I think that's a big old lion, and I'm not going to go. Right? So same thing, they get back to the cave. Og's like, oh, man, that was the best. Oh, man, so good. And Rock is like, oh, I'm still hungry, but whatever. And then the third day they go out, and this time Og approaches something. He doesn't quite know what it is, and he gets eaten. And Rock is back at the cave, and Og doesn't return. He's like, oh. And you see the story, Rock gets all of his tools, he gets his lady, he gets to procreate. He's a little hungrier, but he's alive, right? So this is sort of something that's been built into us, that ambiguity and uncertainty, we are sort of hardwired to see as threatening, right? So like, we are not intrinsically reinforced in approaching novel situations that are ambiguous. So this is where anxiety is completely normal, right? And you may have experienced this when you're like going somewhere where you've never been before, right? Like you're going to take a yoga class at a new studio or go to a gym and you've never been there before. And it's like, how hard is that first time going there? And like once you've been there, oh yeah, okay, now the lockers are over there, and this is where you change your shoes off, and like, right? But like before you go, you're like, what am I gonna do? I don't know. You know? I'll go next week. You know, I think they're offering it again next week. I think I gotta take my car into Jiffy Lube or something. I'll do that, right? Is that right? This sort of like the sense of like the newness, novelty, because it's ambiguous, it's uncertain, and that there's just this response. It's totally natural, right?
I guess I'm also thinking there's a total like reward, like selective reward for like approaching novel situations too. So those two are in balance.
Yeah, they can be for sure. Like there's like with our sort of like hunting and whatnot, and,
Yeah.
and sort of like our love of competition and thrill,
Yeah.
there's something in there as well.
And just like being willing to approach a new area if you're out of food, like, oh, let's see what's over here. Or, like,
Right,
there might
if
be
you're out of
something
food, I mean, yeah,
Right,
there's
yeah.
sort of like, there needs to be some sort of basic
maybe
drive
So, yeah.
in some ways. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to be said about this. And, you know, in this point, there's just something that shows up in our central nervous system. It's just like, I don't know what that is. I'm going to treat it as a threat. It's just safer, right? But if not approaching something also is threatening, then you're sort of in this conflict, and that's where, and then there's a thrill that shows up, and sometimes, and a lot of what we actually look at therapeutically is like, how are you framing the experience of that anxiety, right? Where like we were on a call last night with a bunch of Living Well parents. We have a regular sort of parent forum call, and it was on a topic of anxiety, and we had them do this experiential sort of exercise, kind of walk them through, reflecting on these sort of milestone moments in their life as a parent in relationship to the kids, sort of like, you know, taking their first steps and going to their first time in school or daycare, blah, 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 and just noticing what showed up. And a number of folks talked about the relationship between sort of thrill or excitement and anxiety, right? And you may have heard this sort of phrase that, you know, anxiety is excitement without the breath, right? Like topographically, physiologically, they're very similar. So often, what's shifted is the conceptual frame of meaning that we give to the experience, between whether it's sort of a thrill or whether it's a panic-inducing fright. That makes sense? So it's really one to dance with. That one is really good to see sort of what your mind makes of it. Cool. So let's move on. All right, I'm going to give you a task here. So you're going to have a task, and on this next slide, I want you to not read a thing. I don't want you to read anything. I just want you to count the closed loops that you see, okay? And here we go. Six? Anybody see six? Yeah, 6 closed loops. Okay, cool. No problem, right? So now I want you to do the same thing, same exact thing. Don't read it, just count the closed loops. Okay. Anybody successful at not reading it? No. Right? It's like automatic, right? And when you're talking about sort of like, you know, the cultural messages that we're just inundated with, walking around this world where there's 174 newspapers a day being thrown at us, there's this thing that our minds do that just automatically makes sense of things that we can make sense of, right? Again, ambiguity is kind of threatening, right? You probably don't feel threatened by this piece of Burmese script, right? But there's sort of like it's sort of like, boom, do I know it? Do I not know it? Can I ignore it? Do I need to pay attention to it? Do I need to get away from it? Can I approach it, right? So there's this automatic processing that happens when we see this sort of ambiguous lines like, yep, is it familiar? Is it not familiar? Can I make sense of it? What do I do with it, right? Do I need to pay attention to it because it's a threat? This is kind of like, oh, funny poop, right? So there's this other piece of the prison called the automaticity, right? So let's kind of like take a step back and look at what we've covered. And so when we talk about this with the making of the word prisons, we're looking at these basic processes and these sort of elements of the environment and elements of our own sort of cognitive and behavioral processes. So one is there's a dramatic increase in conceptualizing, right? Due to the rise of technology and media and just the fact that our lives we're relating to sort of computer and technology and just language so much more than we used to be, right? So with that comes a sort of decrease of our attention. You know, the economy of our attention shifts more to the conceptual realm, less contact with the 5 sense experiencing. So in the rule and sensitivity and with the loss of 5 sense experiencing, we're relating more and more to the sort of cognitive rules that we make about the world, and just be like, does it work? Okay, yeah, sure, okay, I got it, great. And then we sort of lose contact with whether or not it actually works in new environments, right? And with that, we have this inherited negativity bias where we sort of like, ambiguity is kind of threatening unless you're a total thrill junkie in some ways, and then it can be pretty cool. And then all of this kind of shows up because we're just being bombarded with messages that we just make sense of, right? And the transformation of stimulus function, right? Like, you see this like, you know, this dude with like six-pack and this girl like the body, and they're on the beach, and there's like a sign that's just like Versace or something like that. You're like, they don't have handbags, so what the heck? But it's like Versace, the transformation of stimulus function, right? It's just like, oh, I'm comparing, which is another thing that we kind of do through language. I'm comparing. So, I think I want that, right? Like, is that me? Versace? Maybe Versace, I get that, right? And it's like, it's this weird thing that happens that we just sort of create all these associations and these rules, right? Cool. I am feeling like, let's see, we only got 20 minutes left. Are there any questions right now? All right. So, I love this slide, and yeah, so anybody have this experience? Just sort of going out for a walk, kind of wanting to connect with something that like you really like to do, it's kind of meaningful, take it up. Why is this really meaningful, right? And actually this is more like the experience that you're having. You're out there walking, but it's like this is what you're paying attention to, right? Your mind is just giving you this stuff. Right? And your dog is just like, what? Good sun and trees. I like this. Dog. Squirrel. Right? And you're like, oh, did I get that done? Oh my gosh, I got this work to do when I get home. What am I going to have for dinner? Blah, blah, blah. Do I need to go shopping? Blah, blah, blah. Right? So, what are we saying here? It's like, this is just kind of like, you know, this is kind of happening more and more regularly because of the world that we're living in and the tools that we're relating to. And so we're not saying that like, well, you know, just cut out the language centers of your brain and you'll be much happier. That's not, you know, be like a dog. Nah. My dogs are pretty freaking happy, yes. But it's like, I want to do more things than my dog can do. And so what we're saying is like, if this is just kind of happening more and more regularly as a function of the environment we're living in, and as a natural function of the processes of our language, well, we need to learn how to do some things to relate to this new environment, right? So this is really making a case for the, you know, what's going on when we see over the last 20 years a massive rise of interest in the scientific community about mindfulness and its benefits, its therapeutic effects, right? Like in the mid-90s, you could hardly find a scholarly paper written about mindfulness. And I think it was something like a few years ago, if you did a search of keywords in all psychology dissertations, mindfulness was like the most common single word. So there's something happening that we are now as a species in the modern world looking at like what is happening with this mindfulness thing. And there's a sort of a case to be made here that this rise of interest is actually an evolutionary force that's coming to bear to meet new challenges of a rapidly changing environment that we're creating for ourselves, right? So that we have to adapt or get carried away and swept away by these sort of unconscious, automatic associations that are being programmed to us with no particular intelligence about our own well-being. I would argue that a lot of the information that we're taking in is giving us associations with an intention to change our behavior in order to make a purchase, in order to acquire a certain thing. That's what a lot of the information that we're taking in is. And so, if we're interested in having more intentional behavior, we have to learn how to actually create a relationship to our thinking and to our process, so that when our mind is just naturally sort of automatically regurgitating different associations that it's been programmed with, right, during the day. It's like, thin is good, you know, laughter is great. If you're not laughing, what's wrong with you? Anger is bad, don't yell, but you can't be happy unless you have money, and if you don't have money, how can you not be angry? Don't yell! Right? It's like all these rules. It's like, how do you sort through all that, right? So you have to learn how to separate and look at your thoughts and be like, wow, that's an interesting thought. As opposed to simply being swept away by like the cognitive stream of like, do this, don't do that. Right? Like that example of the client that I was talking about earlier with the text messaging, where his mind was giving him so many different messages in rapid succession that's actually great grist for an intervention that looks at like look at how fickle the mind is. How can you orient consistently if you're just going off of what your mind is telling you, right? We have to figure out how to sort of do the recycling sorting, right? Like just this heap of cognitive messages that we accumulate through the day, and like just sort of like, okay, that's not terribly helpful, that's really painful, not terribly helpful, it's going to come back. That's helpful, I want to pay attention to that. How do we actually do that, right? We need to train our minds. And so this is really, the sort of rise of the third wave behavioral treatments, where it's not so much about changing your thoughts, it's about changing the relationship you have to your thoughts, right? Recognizing that there's a you that's thinking. There's a you that's aware of the thoughts. So one of the ways to think about this is the training in attentional flexibility, being able to take our attention and place it back to an area that we would, to an object or to a process that we would choose to pay attention to, right? And this is a lot of what we're training when we're doing a shamatha meditation practice, or focus on the breath, or focus on a candle, or saying like a mantra or something like that, is when we get carried away, when we get swept away by tangents and thinking, it's like, oh, I noticed that, and then I'm coming back. And that's like a muscle that you're training, is that attentional flexibility, that I'm coming back. And now I want to pay attention to this, right? And it doesn't mean that we're putting up firewalls against other things, because that doesn't work. Like, we will get carried away. Thoughts will intrude. And then how long does it take for us to notice and then remember what our intention is, and then place our attention with intention, right? So one of those things is that five-sense experiencing can be a beautiful antidote to our cognitive flood. This is part of the resourcing in trauma work, right? When you're doing trauma work and somebody's being really activated, helping that person develop a greater attentional flexibility to contact some stimuli that are here and now, that then take their attention and sort of relativize their thinking, like the sort of images, the memories, the sort of emotional tones, all of that. You can sort of connect with here and now experience, where there's sort of plant, you're taking that attention, putting it there, and then it trains the subject to see that the phenomena that they're relating to with that re-experiencing of trauma is internal, it's conceptual, it's cognitive, and that there's a here and now that they can access, that can bring their attention and actually open up open up the container of their subjective experience, such that those memories and those visions can exist within a greater relative space. Does that make sense? It's like that sort of Zen saying that, like, you know, a teaspoon of salt in a glass of water is undrinkable. A teaspoon of salt in a great lake, there's no difference. And it's sort of like we're trying to help people open up their container. And then we'll talk more about acceptance and diffusion skills, probably on different training when we do a little bit more specific work with ACT and the matrix of psychological flexibility. Let's see. And in this slide, I haven't fully figured out why this slide is in here. I should take this out, but sort of, I think we were kind of wrapping it all up. So, you know, with these challenges of the word, you know, these word prisons and the sort of inundation with with thoughts, is like, how do we actually do the sorting between all of the different messages that our minds are going to sort of put forward to us? So we have to actually focus on workability of what we're trying to do. What are we up to, right? So this is where the values comes in, as that steady point to orient us around what am I trying to do? What am I up to? It's not sort of about what am I thinking right now. That's a different process. What am I up to? What am I trying to do here? And that has to do with my values. What am I trying to connect with, right? And then, given that, what is going to be helpful for me to focus on, to bring my attention to, right? So that attentional flexibility is sort of a necessary precursor. It's a sort of necessary process in order to unhook from what's unhelpful and then bring our attention to bear to what is helpful, right? And so one of the cast seeds of doubt on all conceptualizations, recognizing that all the rules that we've learned, all the relationships that we've made are arbitrary, right? The plant, or the leaf, is the father of the car, right? Good girls don't yell. Arbitrary. What is good when it comes to a human being, right? We start to have to really look at the arbitrary frame. We're looking at, well, good is a virtue that's been socially defined by X, Y, and Z, and it looks different based on which language community you're in, or which family you grew up in, or which first grade teacher you had who gave you the rules that you inferred or were told explicitly and took on and then started applying, even if they didn't work, right? Is this making sense? Coming together?
Yeah.
Cool. And so then we use the therapeutic relationships, you know, words and presence to transform stimulus functions of confusion, pain, and struggle. So what I mean by that is that, like, oftentimes people come to us and they see their confusion and their pain and the struggle that they've had in a sort of correspondence, it meaning that my confusion equals I'm weak, I'm dumb, I'm broken, right? So we need to transform the stimulus function of confusion, because confusion happens everywhere, right? If you haven't been confused when you're sitting with a client, well, get used to it. So one of the things we do, like confusion, I like to see confusion. Did I talk about this yesterday with you? For someone, that like, confusion is an opportunity to actually make new choices, because you're actually unhooked from a total adherence to what you know but hasn't worked. And it's like, well, what I know doesn't work, so I don't know what to do, so I'm confused. Yes! Awesome! Great!
Yeah.
Let's work on figuring out what actually works, not what you believe is true, right? Because it's actually, let's focus on what works to get you to where you want to go. And we'll call that true. It's true to your values, if it serves them, right? Okay. And then develop a relationship that models flexibility and values-driven responding, right? So this is just like how we hold ourselves. Are we rigidly adhering to rules? Are we coming in with a sense of like, I know what to do, and just keep going at it? If it's not working with a client to move us towards the end, it's like we have to shift what we're doing and be flexible, be open, and paying attention, right? Cool. And let's see. So to end with a quote from one of my favorites, Rumi. Be empty of worrying. Think of who created thought. Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? Cool. So that's a word prisons talk. So thanks y'all for sticking with it, and we've got a few minutes left for questions if you want to engage there, or thoughts or musings.
I have a question that's not related to this presentation.
Okay. Before we go there, are there any
Yeah.
questions or musings or thoughts that are related?
It's interesting for me right now because I went on my first retreat at the beginning of the summer. And one thing that I really walked away from the retreat, like one of my big insights was that, like, not to believe all of my thoughts that I had. Because when I came in, I had all these negative thoughts that I just believed 100% without even questioning them at all. But then, like, realizing that they probably aren't true was huge for me. So anything that goes along with this.
Yeah. From this perspective, truth is a very slippery thing. We don't see something as absolutely true. In the sense that any sort of verbal construction is a construction. It's pointing at something.
Yeah.
And so when we're talking about sort of how does this apply to our work with clients, right? We have to recognize that the world that we've created is true for us. We relate to it as if it's real. That's what we do, right? Somebody hangs up on me, and I feel like I'm a horrible person because I wasn't able to contact them. I wasn't able to reach through them. And then all of my associations with that show up for me, and that's real, right? And at the same time, it's a total construction. And so helping me to sort of like see that while also honoring the pain and being with me in relationship, and not just, that's just your verbal construction, as sort of a dismissive tactic to get away from the actual truth of the pain.
Yeah.
Like that's really where the beautiful dance comes in.
Holding both of those, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just thinking about, we're able to, as not only students, but being here as interns, to be able to deconstruct some of this, where some of the clients we work with, they can't, or their own thoughts are not allowing them to. And I think of the guy you told us about who now is working on his doctorate.
He's
or-
working,
or
yeah,
as a
he's
doctor or
yeah.
practicing doctor,
Yeah.
like there's that person over here, and now there's this person who exists now,
Yeah.
and like, yeah.
Yeah.
So the big picture of it all, that's exciting.
Yeah.
And it's so hard to like escape. Like, yeah. So
Yeah.
everything is so, all the thoughts and whatever, the messages and the interjects are so compelling. It's
Mhm.
like, God, it feels like just thinking about like helping like early 20s, like young adults with this, it's like, gosh, I remember when I was that age, like my beliefs were so hard.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's just, it's a lot of work.
Definitely.
Yeah, it is.
What we were talking about yesterday, it takes a lot of courage to do this work, right? Our clients show up, and most of them don't know it, how much courage they're demonstrating by just walking through that door.
Such a good point.
Cool. Well, thank you. So, let me just talk top of this thing.